Blood shouldn't smell like burnt sugar. But as Dr. Arthur Hayes dug his bare hands into the chest cavity of a dying alien royal, the sickly sweet scent choked the operating room. He didn't want a medal. He definitely didn't want a bride. He just wanted a decent cup of coffee. The overhead fluorescents in Medbay 4 emitted a high-pitched, uneven whine that drilled directly into the base of Arthur's skull. It was a terrible sound, grating and relentless, but it was currently losing a war against the frantic, wet noises coming from the operating table. Clamps, give me the heavy ones now. Arthur didn't look up. He couldn't. If he took his eyes off the pulsing, fibrous mass inside the open chest of the woman on the table, she was going to die. Her biology was a nightmare of evolutionary redundancy, a secondary cardiovascular node that pumped a thick, dark, violet fluid, currently geysering over Arthur's forearms. It smelled exactly like caramelized sugar burning at the bottom of a cheap saucepan. The scent coated the back of his throat, gagging him. "Her pressure is dropping, Doctor," Clara said. The scrub nurse's voice was tight. Clara was a veteran of the frontier rim, a woman who had seen miners pulled apart by gravity shears, but her hands were trembling as she slapped the cold steel clamps into Arthur's palm. "I know it's dropping," Arthur snapped. He tasted salt. Sweat was pooling in his eyebrows, threatening to blind him. He blinked hard, sending a stinging drop into the corner of his left eye. He ignored it. "She's bleeding out from a ruptured venous strut, or whatever the hell they call it. Suction." The hissing vacuum tube dove into the violet swamp. Arthur plunged his fingers in right behind it. The texture of her internal organs was wrong. Human tissue had a certain give, a familiar elasticity. This felt like wet leather and shattered fiberglass. The bone fragments from her crushed sternum were slicing through his latex gloves, biting into the meat of his fingers. He felt the warm slide of his own red blood mixing with her sticky, sweet violet fluid. Find the tear. Just find the goddamn tear. His fingers brushed against a pulsing, torn edge. The rupture. It was massive, jagged, the result of a high-velocity impact from whatever assassination attempt had brought the Royal Vanguard crashing into his station. "Got it," he grunted, bearing down with his left hand to pinch the artery shut against her spine. The geyser stopped. The sudden silence in the room, save for the whining light and the erratic thump-thump of the monitor, was deafening. "She's stabilizing," Clara breathed, her eyes darting to the overhead screen. "Temporary," Arthur wheezed. His back was screaming. He had been bent over this table for 4 hours. His knees were locked, his shoulders burning. "The moment I let go, she bleeds out. I can't stitch this. The tissue is too friable. It'll tear like wet tissue paper." "Then what do we do?" Arthur looked at the girl on the table. Princess Beatrice. That was the translation her diplomatic entourage had provided anyway. She looked terrifyingly human on the outside, save for the pale, luminescent quality of her skin and the faint, geometric ridges along her jawline. She was young, maybe 20, and she was dying because some political rival had packed a plasma charge into her shuttle. Arthur wasn't a hero. He was a disgraced surgeon working a dead-end contract on a mining station that smelled perpetually of sulfur and unwashed bodies. He hated the royals. He hated their arrogance, their pristine clothes, their demands. But he hated losing a patient on his table even more. It was a stubborn, ugly pride. "Get the polyresin sealant from the engineering kit," Arthur ordered. Clara froze. "Dr. Hayes, that's industrial adhesive. It's highly toxic to human tissue. She's not human, Clara. And right now, she's bleeding to death. Get the damn glue." Clara didn't argue. She bolted to the emergency cart, ripping open a bright orange industrial repair kit. She handed him the heavy pistol grip applicator. "Hold her down," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "If she wakes up during this, she'll tear herself in half." He took a breath, letting the sour, recycled air fill his lungs. He swapped his grip on the torn artery, trading his aching left hand for his right, and jammed the nozzle of the applicator into the chest cavity. He squeezed the trigger. The sealant hit the wet, hot tissue and instantly reacted. A plume of acrid grey smoke puffed out of the wound, smelling strongly of burning plastic and ozone. The monitor began to scream. Beatrice's body arched off the table, a violent, involuntary muscle spasm. Clara threw her weight across the princess's legs. Arthur leaned heavily onto her shoulders, pinning her down while he held the nozzle steady, flooding the rupture with liquid resin. The heat radiating from the wound was intense enough to singe the hairs on his forearms. He counted to 10 in his head. 1, 2, 3. Stop fighting, you stubborn brat. 7, 8. Beatrice went limp. The monitor's scream sputtered, pitched down and levelled out into a steady rhythmic chime. Arthur pulled his hands back. The resin had hardened into a jagged, ugly grey mass, completely encasing the torn node. It was butchery. It was an anatomical abomination, but it was holding. Arthur stepped back from the table. His knees buckled slightly. He caught himself on the edge of the scrub sink, his chest heaving. He looked down at his hands. They were trembling violently, coated in a sticky, drying mixture of violet and red. "Close her up, Clara," Arthur said, his voice cracking. He turned the tap on with his elbow. The water came out freezing cold. He plunged his hands under the stream, watching the cheap, harsh soap foam up pink and purple before spiralling down the drain. "I need to sit down before I pass out." He didn't get the chance. The heavy pneumatic doors of the surgical suite hissed open. The loud, rhythmic thud of heavy boots echoed against the sterile tiles. Arthur didn't turn around. He just squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his forehead against the cold mirror above the sink. Let me rest. Just for 5 minutes. "Dr. Hayes." The voice was a low, resonant rumble that vibrated in Arthur's teeth. He sighed, grabbed a rough paper towel and turned around. King Edward filled the doorway. That wasn't an exaggeration. The alien monarch stood nearly 7 feet tall, his broad shoulders draped in heavy midnight blue velvet that looked absurdly out of place against the peeling white paint of Medbay 4. He was flanked by 2 guards in dark, matte black armour. They carried kinetic rifles. Arthur noted with a cynical kind of amusement that they hadn't bothered to wipe the mud off their boots before stepping into a sterile environment. "Your Majesty," Arthur said. He didn't bow. He was too tired, and his lower back was locked up. He tossed the crumpled, blood-stained paper towel into a hazardous waste bin. "Your daughter is alive." Edward stared at him. The king's face was a harsher, older version of his daughter's, the geometric ridges along his jaw thick and pronounced, almost like bone plating. His eyes were solid, completely devoid of sclera or irises, pooling like spilled ink. "I have been informed of your methods," Edward said. The translation implant in Arthur's ear rendered the alien's speech into perfectly unaccented formal English. It made the situation feel entirely surreal. "You utilized industrial chemicals. You mutilated her internal structure." Arthur scoffed, a short, bitter sound escaping him before he could stop it. "I saved her life. The plasma charge blew a hole in her chest the size of a grapefruit. She was hemorrhaging out. If you'd prefer, I can go dig the resin out and you can watch her bleed to death. It's up to you." The guards tensed, their hands dropping to the grips of their rifles. Arthur didn't flinch. He was simply too exhausted to be afraid. He stood there, slouched, his scrub soaked in alien blood, smelling like ozone and sweat. Edward raised a massive gloved hand. The guards stilled. The king stepped into the room. He walked slowly, intentionally, closing the distance between them until he was looming directly over Arthur. Up close, Edward smelled like cold stone and crushed mint. "You're a remarkably insolent creature, Dr. Hayes," Edward murmured. "My physicians assured me she was dead upon arrival. They abandoned her to the void." "Your physicians are cowards," Arthur said flatly. "They didn't want the blame if a royal died on their table. I don't give a damn about your politics. I just fix what's broken." Edward's ink-black eyes searched Arthur's face. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Arthur could hear the faint thump-thump of Beatrice's monitored heartbeat behind him. In our culture, Edward began, his voice dropping to a conversational, almost intimate volume, when one is claimed by the void, their ties to the living are severed. To pull them back is to commit theft against the natural order. Arthur rubbed his temples. A headache was blooming right behind his eyes. Look, if you're going to arrest me for medical malpractice or soul theft or whatever, just get it over with. I need a shower. I am not arresting you, Edward said. I am acknowledging reality. My daughter was dead. Her life was forfeit. You stole it back. By the laws of the Vanguard, her life no longer belongs to her, nor to my house. It belongs to the thief. Arthur paused. His hand stopped rubbing his temple. He blinked, looking up at the towering alien. What? Beatrice is yours, Edward said simply. Arthur stared at him. The words didn't make sense. He processed them like a foreign language he had only briefly studied. Mine? What do you mean, mine? Like an employee, a ward? Like a possession, Edward clarified, his tone devoid of any parental warmth. A wife? A servant? A trophy? The terminology is irrelevant. You possess her life. She will remain with you. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through Arthur's exhaustion. Whoa, hold on. No, absolutely not. I'm a doctor, not a human trafficker. You can't just hand a person over to me because I did my job. It is done, Edward said. He didn't raise his voice, but the finality in it was absolute. It sounded like a steel door slamming shut. To refuse the transfer of a life debt is a grave insult. It implies the life you saved is worthless. Such an insult is answered with blood. Arthur looked at the two guards. They were staring at him. He looked at the king. Edward wasn't posturing, he was stating a fact of his reality. If Arthur said no, they would likely kill him, kill Clara, and probably raze the entire station just to make a point about honour. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. He felt cornered, a rat trapped in a sterile white box. He looked past the king to the operating table where the young woman lay unconscious, her chest bound in thick white bandages. He thought about the rent in her heart, the grey resin holding her together. He didn't want this. He lived in a 2-room hab unit that smelled like mould. He ate synthetic noodles for dinner. He drank too much cheap whiskey to drown out the tinnitus. He was a disaster of a human being. He couldn't take care of a houseplant, let alone an alien princess. You're abandoning her, Arthur realised, the truth settling in his gut like a cold stone. She was targeted. Keeping her in the royal court makes her a liability. You're using some archaic law to dump her on me so you don't have to protect her. Edward's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed fractionally. You are observant, Doctor. It is a rare trait in your species. See that you keep her alive. If she dies by your negligence, I will return. The king turned on his heel, the heavy velvet cape sweeping the floor. Without another word, he and his guards marched out of the medical bay, the pneumatic doors hissing shut behind them. Arthur stood alone in the silence. The hum of the lights seemed louder now. He looked over at Clara, who was peeking out from behind the supply cabinets, her eyes wide with terror. Did he just... Clara whispered. Yeah, Arthur said, dragging a hand down his face. The drying blood flaked off his skin. He just gave me his daughter. He walked over to a rolling stool and collapsed onto it. He put his head in his hands, breathing in the smell of ozone, burnt sugar and cheap soap. Fuck, Arthur whispered to the empty room. Arthur's quarters were exactly as depressing as he remembered them. He keyed the entry pad, and the metal door slid back with a squeal of rusted tracks. The air inside was stale, smelling faintly of industrial cleaner and the burnt garlic aroma of leftover takeout sitting on the counter. The single overhead light flickered, casting a jaundiced yellow glow over the cramped space. Watch your step. The floor grating is loose by the door, Arthur muttered, shouldering his way inside. He was carrying Beatrice. She was surprisingly light, her bones feeling less dense than a human's, but the awkwardness of hauling an unconscious alien royal through the station's maintenance corridors had left Arthur drenched in a fresh layer of sweat. He navigated the narrow hallway, kicking aside a pile of dirty laundry, and gently deposited her onto his bed. The bed was little more than a foam pad on a steel frame. It squeaked in protest. Beatrice looked entirely wrong lying there. She was still wearing the standard-issue grey hospital scrubs Clara had put her in. But even in the dull fabric, her pale skin and geometric features made her look like a porcelain doll dropped in a mud puddle. Arthur stood over her for a moment, his chest heaving. His back muscles were spasming, a sharp, twisting pain radiating from his spine. He groaned, popping 3 over-the-counter painkillers dry, swallowing them with a grimace. He walked into the tiny kitchenette, turned on the tap and splashed cold water on his face. When he looked up, peering through the open doorway into the bedroom area, Beatrice's eyes were open. They were solid black like her father's, but the pupils were blown out, reacting sluggishly to the dim light. She didn't scream, she didn't thrash. She simply lay perfectly still, her eyes darting around the messy room, taking in the water stains on the ceiling, the overflowing trash can, and finally Arthur. Arthur grabbed a ragged towel, drying his face. He walked back into the room, keeping a respectful distance. "Don't try to sit up," he said. His voice was raspy. "You've got a clump of industrial resin holding your heart together. It needs time to set." Beatrice turned her head slowly. Her gaze was intense, unblinking. "Where am I?" Her voice was softer than the king's, melodious but scraped raw, likely from the intubation tube. The translator in Arthur's ear worked perfectly. "I have a block 4, my quarters," Arthur said. He crossed his arms, suddenly highly self-conscious of the stains on his shirt and the mess in his room. "Your father left you here." Beatrice closed her eyes. A small, almost imperceptible shudder ran through her frame. "I see. The life debt." "Yeah, that." Arthur ran a hand through his messy hair. "Look, I want to be perfectly clear. I didn't ask for this. I don't want a reward. I don't own people. I'm a doctor." Beatrice opened her eyes again. She looked at him with a startling lack of emotion. It wasn't stoicism. It was absolute, terrifying pragmatism. "My desires and yours are irrelevant, Dr. Hayes. The decree was spoken by the king. I am legally dead to the vanguard. If I return to my people, I will be executed as a ghost, a violation of the sacred order. I belong to you." Arthur let out a harsh, barking laugh. "You belong to yourself. The second you're healed, you can get on a shuttle and go anywhere you want. I won't stop you." "And go where?" Beatrice asked softly. Her black eyes locked onto his, and for the first time Arthur saw a flicker of genuine fear beneath the icy exterior. "I have no currency. I have no identity. I have no skill suited for a Rimwood mining station. I am a target. The men who placed the explosive in my shuttle will not stop simply because my father discarded me. If you put me out that door, Doctor, I will be dead before the station cycle ends." Arthur felt a headache returning with a vengeance. She was right. The frontier was ruthless. A lone, defenseless royal with no money and assassins on her tail wouldn't last a day. "Damn it," Arthur whispered. He paced the short length of the room, rubbing his neck. "Damn it, damn it, damn it." He stopped and looked at her. She was watching him, her hands trembling slightly against the coarse blanket. She was trying so hard to look brave, but she was just a terrified kid who had been blown up, glued back together, and disowned by her family in the span of 12 hours. Arthur's cynicism, his protective armour of apathy, cracked just a fraction. He let out a long, slow exhale, the fight draining out of him. Fine," Arthur grumbled. "Fine. You stay here until we figure something out, but we need ground rules." Beatrice tilted her head. "Rules for my servitude?" "No," Arthur snapped, pointing a finger at her. "Rule number 1, stop saying things like servitude and belong. It creeps me out. We are roommates, unwilling, tragicomically matched roommates." Beatrice looked confused, her brow furrowing. "Roommates?" "Yes. Rule number 2, Arthur continued, walking over to the small closet and pulling out a heavy synthetic wool blanket. "You get the bed. I sleep on the couch. Don't argue with me. The couch is terrible, but your chest is currently held together by duct tape and prayers, so you need the mattress." He threw the blanket onto the battered sofa in the corner of the room. It landed with a dull thud, kicking up a small cloud of dust. "Rule number 3, Arthur said, turning back to her. "If you feel a sharp pain in your chest, or if you taste metal, you wake me up immediately. Don't try to tough it out." Beatrice watched him as he moved around the cramped space. Her expression was unreadable. "You are contradictory, Arthur Hayes. You speak with hostility, yet you yield your bed to a possession." "Told you, you're not a possession," Arthur muttered, kicking off his boots. He collapsed onto the couch, the springs groaning loudly in protest. He pulled the scratchy blanket over his chest, staring up at the water-stained ceiling. "And I'm not hostile," Arthur added, closing his eyes. "I'm just really, really tired. Go to sleep, Princess." Silence descended on the room, save for the rhythmic hum of the ventilation system. For a long time, Arthur thought she'd fallen asleep. He was drifting off himself, the exhaustion finally pulling him under, when her soft voice broke the quiet. "My name is Beatrice," she whispered into the dim room. "You do not need to call me Princess anymore. I am not one." Arthur didn't open his eyes. He just pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders. "Good night, Beatrice." In the dark, smelling stale takeout and the lingering scent of burnt sugar still clinging to his hands, Arthur Hayes realized his simple, miserable life was over. The universe had dropped an alien royal into his lap, and he had absolutely no idea how to keep her, or himself, alive. The coffee machine sounded like a dying asthmatic. It sputtered, choked, and spat a thin stream of dark, oily liquid into a chipped ceramic mug. Arthur stood in front of it, wearing the same blood-stained scrub trousers from yesterday and a faded grey undershirt that clung tightly to his damp skin. His back throbbed with a dull, relentless ache. The couch had felt exactly like sleeping on a canvas bag full of loose wrenches. He took a slow sip. It tasted like battery acid and burnt dirt. Perfect. He turned around, leaning heavily against the cheap laminate of the kitchenette counter. Beatrice was sitting upright on the very edge of the narrow bed. Her posture was rigidly perfect, her spine aligned perfectly straight despite the obvious screaming agony she must have been experiencing. She had somehow managed to pull one of his spare, oversized wool sweaters over her heavy bandages. The dark, scratchy fabric completely swallowed her pale, delicate frame. "I explicitly told you not to sit up," Arthur said, his voice a dry rasp. He set the mug down. The ceramic base clicked sharply against the metal counter, echoing in the cramped, silent room. "I am functioning optimally," Beatrice replied. Her voice was steady, tightly controlled, but a thin, glossy sheen of sweat coated her forehead, catching the sickly yellow light of the overhead bulb. Arthur snorted, a harsh sound of pure disbelief. "You're lying. You look like you're about to pass out on my floor. Lie back down before you crack the resin shell I built inside your chest cavity." She didn't move a single muscle. She simply stared downward at the rusted floor grating, her solid black eyes tracking a rogue cockroach that scurried frantically into the damp shadows. "If I remain idle, my muscles will begin to atrophy. A possession must remain useful to its owner. Tell me what tasks you require of me today." Arthur squeezed his eyes shut and rubbed his face with his free hand. The thick stubble on his jaw felt like heavy grit sandpaper. "Listen to me very carefully, Beatrice. You're not a maid. You're not a servant. You're a critical patient recovering from a massive catastrophic chest trauma. Your only task right now is not dying, because if you die, your father comes back here, and I am fairly certain he will happily turn my spine into a decorative hat rack." Beatrice looked up at him. The flat, unblinking intensity of her dark gaze was profoundly unnerving. "My father will not return for me. His threat toward you was merely performative. The Vanguard does not care for ghosts. I am erased. Great. Fantastic. So I'm just keeping you alive for my own mental health," Arthur muttered, grabbing a portable medical scanner from his canvas work bag. It was a cheap, bulky, outdated model held together by layers of grey electrical tape. "Lie back against the pillows. Let me see the wound." She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then leaned back against the thin, lumpy pillows. She reached up with trembling fingers and pulled the collar of the heavy sweater down. exposing the thick white bandages wrapped tightly around her torso. Arthur stepped close to the bed. Immediately he smelled the lingering, sickeningly sweet scent of caramelized sugar beneath the sharp, sterile chemical smell of the medical gauze. He carefully peeled the surgical tape back. The skin surrounding the massive incision was deeply bruised, a mottled canvas of yellow and dark green that looked entirely unnatural against her luminescent pale complexion. The grey industrial resin bulged, ugly and hard beneath her sutured flesh. It was a brutal, horrific piece of work, a desperate mechanics fix implemented on a fragile biological engine. "Does it burn?" Arthur asked softly, running the scanner module slowly over her chest. The device clicked rapidly, a chaotic rhythm of data. "It feels heavy," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the water stains dotting the ceiling. "Like a cold, jagged stone has been permanently lodged behind my ribs." "That's because there is a literal hardened stone lodged behind your ribs," Arthur grunted, squinting to read the tiny, scratched digital screen. "Your secondary cardiovascular node is compensating for the blockage. Blood pressure is incredibly low, but it remains stable. I don't see any active internal bleeding. Honestly, it's a profound medical miracle." "It is not a miracle, Doctor. It is your skill." Arthur paused. He looked down at her face. She wasn't flattering him. She was stating it as a cold, undeniable clinical fact. It made him deeply uncomfortable. He was used to being the disgraced station butcher, the guy you went to when you couldn't afford a real hospital on a civilized core world. He wasn't used to reverence. "It's industrial glue, Beatrice," he said quietly, taping the bandages firmly back down against her skin. "I glued your internal organs together." "And yet, I am breathing," she countered. She reached up slowly, her cold, slender fingers lightly brushing against the back of his rough hand. Her touch was highly hesitant, as if she fully expected him to yank his hand away in disgust. He didn't move. Her skin felt exactly like smooth, chilled marble. "Why do you constantly diminish your own actions, Arthur Hayes? You preserved my life when my own royal physicians abandoned me to the void." "Because I know exactly how fragile this situation is," Arthur muttered, finally pulling his hand away and stepping backward, suddenly needing physical distance. The dented metal walls of the tiny hab unit felt entirely too close, pressing in on him. "You're a high-value target. You said it yourself last night. The people who blew up your transport shuttle are eventually going to figure out you aren't sitting in the station morgue." He walked back to the counter, picked up his coffee, and took another drink. It was entirely lukewarm now, tasting even worse. "Station security here is a complete joke. If a professional hit squad comes knocking, the local cops will just point them directly to my door and ask them for a generous tip. I have a rusty scalpel, a bad back, and a hangover. I can't protect you from trained killers." Beatrice slowly swung her legs over the side of the squeaking mattress. She planted her bare feet on the cold floor and stood up. Her knees buckled instantly. Arthur lunged forward, dropping his mug. It shattered on the floor, splashing cold coffee across his boots. He caught her hard by the shoulders right before she hit the unyielding metal floor grating. Her hands flew up, gripping his forearms like desperate iron vices. She was trembling violently, entirely lacking the physical strength to support her own weight, but she forced herself to remain upright, leaning heavily against his chest. Her erratic breath hitched, warm against his collarbone, smelling faintly of metallic mint and sickness. "Then we do not stay here," Beatrice whispered, staring fiercely up at his chin. "We run." Arthur held her steady, his hands gripping her thin arms. He could feel the erratic, heavy thump of her augmented heart vibrating against his own chest cavity. Running. Leaving the mining station meant fully giving up his meager contract, his miserable but predictable life. It meant stepping out into the absolute unknown void with a hunted, critically injured alien royal. It was a terrible idea. It was unequivocally the worst idea he had ever entertained. "We," Arthur repeated slowly, testing the heavy weight of the word. "You claimed my life," she said. her grip painfully tightening on his arms. "I am inextricably bound to you. If I run, you must run with me." He looked around the dingy, depressing apartment, the dark water stains spreading across the ceiling, the scurrying roaches, the rusted, rattling ventilation grate that blew cold air onto his neck. "Fine," Arthur sighed. The sound was heavy, ragged, completely devoid of heroics. "I always hated this miserable place anyway." The heavy metallic thump echoed violently through the small hab unit, shaking grey dust from the loose ceiling panels. Arthur froze instantly. He was right in the middle of aggressively stuffing a portable trauma kit, several rolls of bandages, and a handful of purloined surgical tools into a faded canvas duffel bag. Beatrice was sitting quietly on the couch, watching him pack with wide, calculating eyes. Another violent thump. The reinforced metal of the door groaned loudly in protest. It wasn't a polite knock. Someone was actively applying a magnetic breaching ram to the exterior locking mechanism. "They found us," Beatrice said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, devoid of any panic. Arthur dropped the canvas bag. Pure panic, sharp and icy, flooded his veins, making his fingertips tingle. He stared at the heavy steel door. The internal locking mechanism was already screaming, the thick metal actively bending inward under immense localized kinetic pressure. "Get in the bathroom right now," Arthur hissed, his voice cracking. "I will not hide in a closet while you are murdered." "Get in the damn bathroom," Arthur roared, dropping his cynical facade. He grabbed her firmly by the arm, hauling her up and shoving her roughly toward the narrow sliding door. "If they see you, we both die immediately. If they just see me, maybe I can talk my way out of it." It was a pathetic lie, and they both inherently knew it. Beatrice stumbled awkwardly into the tiny, mildew-smelling bathroom. Arthur forcefully slammed the sliding door shut and quickly engaged the exterior manual lock. He spun around frantically, his wide eyes scanning the messy room for any conceivable weapon. He owned no firearms. He had precise surgical tools. Wielding a tiny surgical scalpel against military-grade body armor was a laughable joke. The heavy door hinges shrieked in agony. The steel warped further inward. Arthur's desperate eyes locked onto the tall green medical oxygen tank standing neglected in the corner, and the heavy-duty industrial plasma cutter he kept in his toolkit for violently extracting fused cybernetics. It was a desperate, unhinged thought. It was practically suicidal. He lunged for the tank, hauling the incredibly heavy steel cylinder across the floor toward the doorway. He viciously kicked over his small aluminum dining table, creating a pathetic, flimsy barricade. He frantically unscrewed the brass regulator entirely off the top of the oxygen tank, leaving the main valve completely exposed to the open air. He grabbed the heavy plasma cutter, dropped to his knees, and crouched low behind the overturned table. The magnetic breaching ram fired one final time. The primary lock shattered into jagged shrapnel. The heavy door blew inward with terrifying force, slamming aggressively against the interior wall with a deafening, thunderous crash. 3 large men stepped fluidly into the room. They weren't wearing the cheap padded uniforms of station security. They wore advanced matte black tactical gear, their faces completely obscured by dark polarized visors. They held suppressed compact kinetic submachine guns tight to their armored shoulders. They smelled intensely of chemical gun oil and the sterile cold scent of hard vacuum. "Clear the room! Locate the primary target," the lead operative barked, his cold voice heavily distorted by a helmet vocal emitter. They stepped forward in perfect, terrifying synchronization. Arthur didn't let himself think. If he paused to think about the reality of his situation, his entire body would freeze in mortal terror. He gripped the heavy handle of the plasma cutter, his sweaty hands shaking so violently he could barely depress the primary ignition switch. He kicked the base of the oxygen tank as hard as he could. The heavy green cylinder rolled rapidly across the smooth floor grating, stopping dead center in the ruined doorway, resting directly at the heavy boots of the lead operative. The man instinctively looked down. What the? Arthur squeezed the heavy trigger on the cutter. A blinding, roaring arc of blue-hot plasma violently shot out of the nozzle. He aggressively dragged the superheated beam directly across the exposed brass valve of the rolling oxygen tank. The metal hissed sharply, instantly turned white-hot and catastrophically ruptured. The resulting explosion wasn't a cinematic, fiery blast. It was an incredibly violent, concussive wave. Highly pressurized oxygen violently escaped a suddenly compromised steel vessel. The invisible shockwave hit Arthur like a massive physical blow, throwing his body backward through the air. He slammed brutally against the kitchenette counter. His ears violently popped, a deafening, high-pitched ringing instantly replacing every single sound in the room. Thick grey dust and shattered debris instantly filled the air. Arthur groaned loudly, tasting fresh copper blood in his mouth. He blinked hard through the thick, choking smoke. His aluminum barricade was completely splintered. The 3 tactical operatives were sprawled on the floor. 2 of them weren't moving at all, their advanced armor visibly cracked by the sheer, blunt, concussive force of the heavy tank rocketing into their bodies. The 3rd man, the team leader, was blindly crawling backward toward the corridor. His helmet visor was entirely shattered, and thick, dark blood was pouring freely from his nose and ears. Arthur dragged himself agonizingly to his feet. His vision blurred, swimming dizzily. His entire left arm felt completely numb. He stumbled forward awkwardly, his boots crunching on glass, and picked up a heavy, solid steel wrench he had dropped earlier near the bag. The dazed operative desperately fumbled for his dropped weapon. Arthur didn't hesitate or consider medical ethics. He swung the heavy steel wrench downward, with absolutely everything he had left in his body. It connected brutally with the side of the man's unarmored skull with a wet, heavy, sickening crunch. The man instantly collapsed, entirely limp. Arthur stood perfectly still, his chest heaving violently, the bloody wrench dangling loosely from his limp, shaking fingers. Blood dripped steadily from his own nose, spattering dark crimson onto the grey metal floor. The sharp smell of gun oil was now entirely masked by the heavy metallic tang of fresh human blood. The bathroom door softly clicked open. Beatrice stepped out cautiously. She looked silently at the absolute devastation. The shattered door, the unconscious, or dead, men bleeding on the floor, the violently ruptured steel tank. She looked at Arthur, who was leaning heavily against the damaged counter, coughing up a small, dark fleck of blood. She didn't scream. She didn't shrink back in horror. She walked carefully over the scattered debris, her bare feet stepping lightly and precisely around the fallen, armoured bodies. She reached him, her cold, pale hands coming up gently to cup his sweaty, bruised face. "You're bleeding," she said softly, her thumb brushing his cheek. Arthur let out a choked, wet, half-hysterical laugh. "Yeah, I think I completely blew out my eardrums, and I definitely cracked a couple of ribs." Beatrice traced the dark blood running from his nose with her thumb. "You're not a trained warrior, Arthur Hayes, yet you fought them with absolute ruthlessness." "I told you," Arthur wheezed, sliding slowly down the front of the counter until he was sitting heavily on the floor. "I really hate losing a patient." She knelt gracefully beside him, completely uncaring of the dirt, debris, and pooling blood staining the floor grating. She looked past him at the open, ruined doorway, staring out into the dimly lit corridor. Harsh, wailing alarms were just beginning to blare loudly in the distant sectors. Station security would undoubtedly be here soon. They wouldn't care who started the violent fight. They would only see a dead Core World hit squad and a heavily indebted, disgraced rim doctor. "Can you walk?" Beatrice asked, her solid dark eyes locking intensely onto his tired face. Arthur groaned loudly, aggressively wiping his bleeding mouth with the dirty back of his hand. "Do I honestly have a choice?" "No," she said simply. It was entirely pragmatic. It was freezing cold. But her hands, still resting firmly on his aching shoulders, were surprisingly gentle and grounding. "You preserved my life twice now. We must run immediately. Where is the nearest ship hangar?" Arthur forcefully pushed himself up off the floor, deliberately ignoring the screaming sharp pain in his ribs. He grabbed the heavy trauma bag from the floor. He looked intently at the alien princess, her luminescent pale skin contrasting so sharply with the oversized, dingy wool sweater. She looked utterly ridiculous. She looked deeply terrified beneath her calm mask, and she looked entirely dependent on him for her continued survival. "Level 3, Arthur grunted painfully, limping awkwardly toward the ruined door. "We have to take the maintenance service vents. It's going to smell exactly like raw sewage and engine grease." "I do not care about the scent," Beatrice said immediately, stepping boldly over the metal threshold out into the flashing corridor. She turned back to face him, extending a slender hand. Arthur stared down at her pale, delicate fingers for a long moment. He thought about his quiet, utterly miserable life. He thought about the sickeningly sweet, burnt sugar smell of her blood on his hands. He realized he didn't want to die here alone. He reached out firmly, his rough, blood-stained human hand tightly gripping hers. "Let's go, roommate," Arthur muttered into the blaring alarms. Together, the broken human doctor and the discarded alien princess disappeared into the dark, humming belly of the mining station, leaving absolutely nothing behind them but spilled blood and shattered metal. The path ahead is dangerous, marked by betrayal and the cold reality of their newfound bond. But Arthur and Beatrice have survived the impossible by relying on each other. Their journey from a sterile, dying room to the vast, uncertain void has only just begun. If you are moved by their raw, imperfect struggle for survival, please hit that like button, share this story with a fellow sci-fi enthusiast, and subscribe for more gripping tales. Your support fuels their ongoing fight.